of the civil rights movement.
Any social movement that reaches its basic objectives, the question then arises, what next? And Martin began to ponder this question as early as 1964, and certainly by the the Selma March in early 1965, Martin began to question this. It's not just a question of opportunity. It's not just a question of fairness, the way the liberals define it. It's also a question of how do you realize true human justice? How do you empower those who are oppressed? If you gain access to a lunch counter and you can drink a cup of coffee there, what good does it do if you have no money in your pocket?
A movement takes time to develop. You can't jump from A to Z in one leap when you're talking about a society and a community and social and political economic issues that you have to confront. So that took us time. A lot of the folk who were in the 60s, early 60s, were people who were committed to a nonviolent perspective in terms of race, but were not committed to a nonviolent perspective in terms of Vietnam.
Make no mistake about the character of this war. Our adversaries have done us at least one great service. They have described this war for what it is in unmistakable terms. It is meant to be the opening salvo in a series of bombardments, or as they are called in Peking, wars of liberation. And if it succeeds in South Vietnam, then, as Marshal Lin Pao says, and I quote him, the people in other parts of the world will see that what the Vietnamese people can do, they can do too.
As long as King focused his struggles for empowerment and reform to the African American community, and as long as he talked in terms of race, then King might be a thorn in the side of the FBI, and he might be a problem for the Johnson administration to a limited degree. But he really did not pose a fundamentally radical challenge to the system of power. But when King took up the question after the passage and ratification of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, he took up the question of America's involvement in the war in Vietnam and how billions of dollars was being spent abroad that we needed for domestic reconstruction at home. When he took up the issue of poor people's rights, the need not just to have a right to vote, but a human right to a job, that homelessness should be abolished, everyone should have clean, affordable shelter, that education should be free and available to all, not just public schools, but university education, that we do something about the great inequalities of wealth and power and privilege, which are structurally stratified within the society. When King began to talk this way, that's when he posed a threat to the system.
What Hoover does is, not only in the case of King, but other critics of the war, is send on these reports. And the White House specifically requested, in the midst of this very deep political crisis, that the FBI share information with members of Congress that challenged the loyalty of the administration's anti-war critics, so that the Bureau was doing that at the request of the White House. That was a problem for Hoover to do that, because I think he shared not necessarily Johnson's political interest, but his ideological orientation and the attempt to discredit the militant civil rights and anti-war movements.
Bill Moyers, when he was a leading White House aide in the LBJ administration, was one of the individuals that circulated a monograph which was full of red-baiting material about Martin Luther King that turns out now to be totally scurrilous, suggesting that this great intellectual was a dupe of Moscow and that this white former communist sympathizer was leading him around by the nose. I mean, it's vicious racism, and this monograph was just scurrilous. And like many of the White House aides, Walter Jenkins was in on it. Bill Moyers and others were circulating this material throughout the government, and this material was also sent to journalists.
That I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. I speak out against it not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and above all with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as the moral example of the world. I speak out against this war because I am disappointed with America. There can be no great disappointment where there is no great love.
King's growing opposition to the Vietnam War is causing him considerable trouble. A siege attitude develops at the White House, creating an aura of paranoia. John P. Roach, an advisor to President Lyndon Johnson, in a memo describes Dr. King. Quote, King, in desperate search for a constituency, is thrown in with the commies. The civil rights movement is shot, and King, who is inordinately ambitious and quite stupid, is destroying his reputation and painting himself into a corner, unquote. The Washington Post criticized King by saying that his objections to the war were sheer inventions and unsupported fantasy. Life magazine called King's remarks demagogic slander that sounded like a script for Radio Hanoi. Black columnist Carl Rowan, former director of the CIA-linked U.S. Information Agency, attacks King and questions whether he was receiving his information from communists.
By that time, King was a very, very influential American figure. I mean, he had moved beyond the civil rights movement to become an American figure. And so when he spoke to that issue, I mean, he brought the church community along with him. He brought the liberal community along with him. He brought the young people along with him. He brought the black community along with him. And for Johnson to have somebody with that moral authority speaking in the community, he had to go after. I mean, Johnson went after King.
There was a counter-revolution in the country, so to speak. The public opinion had turned around against Vietnam War. You had peaceful demonstrations. You had anti-war demonstrations all over the country on college campuses. You had Dr. King now joining not just civil rights demonstrations, but he held probably the largest anti-Vietnam peaceful demonstration in New York City and off down Fifth Avenue, one of the biggest. And I think there were a lot of concern among what had been called the so-called paranoid patriots that were so pro-Vietnam War that they saw any type of dissent as treason.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover put it in perspective when he said, in his testimony before the House Appropriations Committee in 1962,
since its inception, the Communist Party, USA, has been alert on every possible issue or event which could be used to exploit the American Negro in furtherance of party aims.
Moscow's former top representative in America, John Porgeny, quotes the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin.
It is the basic duty of the Communist Party to develop all revolutionary possibilities of the Negro race, to transform the Solid South and the Black Belt from reserve forces of the bourgeoisie to reserve forces for the proletariat.
Stalin's image of the southern states makes them a solid coalition for oppressing and suppressing the Negroes living within their borders.
In the summer of 1967, American cities erupt in flames. For the past 2 years, violence has become a part of the American urban landscape. By 1967, first Newark, New Jersey, and then Detroit, Michigan, have seen significant civil disturbances. FBI and CIA sources are convinced that the urban disturbances are the work of communists.
If you look at the Civil Rights Coalition, what you see is not a monolithic organization, but a united front of progressive groups, of progressive as well as kind of moderate groups. On the right, you had the Urban League, which was a civil rights organization, but essentially pursued a strategy of coalitions with capital and working cordially with big business to try to set up job opportunities and social welfare reform and housing reform for blacks moving to the cities. To the Urban League's left, But still on the right end of the spectrum was the NAACP. It had a legalistic strategy for social change, used the courts. In the center, you had the SCLC. It used nonviolent direct action, social change, Gandhian techniques. To their left would be CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, for a while led by people like James Farmer and Bayard Rustin, and later by Floyd McKissick and Roy Innis. Finally, on the far left, you had, of course, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. If you want to disrupt a broad united front of organizations, from the right to the left and in the center, where do you attack it? You attack it right in the middle. And what do? You attack the person who is most charismatic and most influential in the center. King was at the center of a broad array of movements. If you take him out, in effect, you take out the key that holds the wheel onto the wagon, and the whole wheel falls off. If you remove him, you not only remove a sharp critic of the system, but what you do is you create a pressure in the center forcing collapse. Now, if we can figure this out, don't you think the FBI could figure it out?
We must prevent the rise of a black messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. Elijah Muhammad is less of a threat because of his age. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines, nonviolence, and embrace black nationalism. Carmichael has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way.
They go talking about these little levels of progress that we see here and there, and they say, you know, you've made great progress. Aren't you satisfied? No, we are not satisfied. We will not be satisfied as long as Negro boys and Negro girls are forced to live life without dignity and without respect. We will not be satisfied.
Having long spoken of a Poor People's Alliance, King now puts his words into action. Poor people would descend on the nation's capital, vowing not to leave until something was done about the racial and class biases that dominate parts of the U.S. The Johnson White House, furious with King, demands that the FBI's number 2 man, Cartha DeLoach, keep them informed of King's plans. Their method will be informants and surveillance. The FBI will reply, quote, based on King's recent activities and public utterances, it is clear that he is an instrument in the hands of subversive forces seeking to undermine our nation.
When Martin Luther King in 1967 started talking about Poor People's March and bringing people together the summer of 1968, he suddenly lost the halo, because it did not matter about him leading black people up and down the street. The white establishment could deal with that because that was a segmented approach to solving the problem. And they also knew that there were significant numbers of black people that they could buy off across the country. Elected officials,